Hello and welcome back to Manibil. And welcome back to my deconstruction of David Hume's book, A Treatise of Human Nature from 1739. This time we are diving into part 2, which is called Of the Ideas of Space and Time. And we should head up with section 1, which is called Of the Infinite Divisibility of Our Ideas of Space and Time. So I'm starting the audiobook.
File 10 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 2 of the Ideas of Space and Time. Section 1 of the Infinite Divisibility of Our Ideas of Space and Time. Whatever has the air of a paradox and is contrary to the first and most unprejudiced notions of mankind is often greedily embraced by philosophers as shewing the superiority of their science, which could discover opinions so remote from vulgar conception. On the other hand, anything proposed to us which causes surprise and admiration gives such a satisfaction to the mind that it indulges itself in those agreeable emotions and will never be persuaded that its pleasure is entirely without foundation. From these dispositions in philosophers and their disciples arises that mutual complacence betwixt them. While the former furnish such plenty of strange and unaccountable opinions, and the latter so readily believe them. Of this mutual complacence I cannot give a more evident instance than in the doctrine of infinite divisibility, with the examination of which I shall begin this subject of the ideas of space and time.
Maybe it would be, if, excuse me this, ponder a bit. He's not afraid of taking a stab at other philosophers, and he's not afraid of, giving some kudos to like Berkeley, and rant a bit on Locke and so on, right? So he's very concerned. It's a way of saying that he has studied other philosophers, maybe, right? And then also gives sort of a hint that he can do things his own way. So this is sort of you could say maybe a youthful way of expressing your independence, you could say, right? So if we try to not be too concerned with his sort of his roasting abilities, then he says something like, from these dispositions in philosophers and their disciple arises that mutual complacence betwixt them, while the former furnish such a plenty of strange and unaccountable opinions, and the latter so readily believe them. There is some observation in that I find actually to be quite important. Now, I know that it's not particularly good philosophy to start arguing like this. I would say it isn't, right? I don't find it a good way to argue. But now he's done it, and I'm sort of, stepping out of the metaphysics and trying to account for what he's saying here, right? He is appealing, in my opinion, to various aspects that I have been very much concerned about in my recent deconstruction of Bernardo Kastrup and his analytic idealism. And that is, all those who come back at my videos and complain are obviously working from the idea that they are disciples of his thinking. For whatever reason, they have become a kind of disciple and defend it tooth and nail. It doesn't matter if it's right, but it fits their bill. So they defend it because they want the philosophy, no matter how crappy it may be. Right? I'm not saying necessarily crappy, but it's not based on philosophical rigidity. It's rather based on emotional stuff and psychology and wanting to have a backup kind of sophistry that supposedly is philosophy, but that's an aspect of sophistry, right? So that they can sort of say, well, Bernardo Kastrup says, so it's okay that I believe in this, that, and the other. And I think that that's what he is saying, that people generally don't think for themselves, but they're finding, oh, there's something that sounds like it explains how I already think. And I will become a disciple of that person who keeps telling me I'm okay as I am, right? This is such it's so prevalent in let's say human thinking that it's unbelievable, right? Show me a philosopher who is not appealing to some kind of group, right? Who's not saying we do this, we do that. There's this group, there's this culture. It's society at large. It's civilization. It's everybody. So all this kind of we are in it together. Let's kumbaya, hold hands, right? Hume is completely opposite. This is Hume's philosophy. That comes across very strongly to me, right? He's not a disciple of anybody, right? He is his own philosopher. That is a sign of strength, that you dare to stand on your own feet. And even if for hundreds of years somebody has talked about whatever Aristotle said or whatever Plato said, he doesn't care. If it doesn't fit the structure, he's not going to just take it because somebody says so, right? So it's an appeal to reject arguments from authority or arguments from, I like this philosophy. It has to be neutral and rigid and be, you have to be able to argue for it. You can't just conjure up whatever you want because you want it, right? Okay, so this is sort of a little rant from me on that particular aspect.
It is universally allowed that the capacity of the mind is limited and can never attain a full and adequate conception of infinity. And though it were not allowed, it would be sufficiently evident from the plainest observation and experience. It is also obvious that whatever is capable of being divided in infinitum must consist of an infinite number of parts, and that it is impossible to set any bounds to the number of parts without setting bounds at the same time to the division. It requires scarce any induction to conclude from hence that the idea which we form of any finite quality is not infinitely divisible, but that by proper distinctions and separations we may run up this idea to inferior ones, which will be perfectly simple and indivisible. In rejecting the infinite capacity of the mind, we suppose it may arrive at an end in the division of its ideas. Nor are there any possible means of evading the evidence of this conclusion. It is therefore certain that the imagination reaches a minimum and may raise up to itself an idea of which it cannot conceive any subdivision and which cannot be diminished without a total annihilation. When you tell me of the 1,000th and 10,000th part of a grain of sand, I have a distinct idea of these numbers and of their different proportions. But the images which I form in my mind to represent the things themselves are nothing different from each other, nor inferior to that image by which I represent the grain of sand itself, which is supposed so vastly to exceed them. What consists of parts is distinguishable into them, and what is distinguishable is separable. But whatever we may imagine of the thing, the idea of a grain of sand is not distinguishable nor separable into 20, much less into 1,000, 10,000, or an infinite number of different ideas. It is the same case with the impressions of the senses as with the ideas of the imagination. Put a spot of ink upon paper, fix your eye upon that spot, and retire to such a distance that at last you lose sight of it. It is plain that the moment before it vanished, the image or impression was perfectly indivisible. It is not for want of rays of light striking on our eyes that the minute parts of distant bodies convey not any sensible impression, but because they are removed beyond that distance at which their impressions were reduced to a minimum and were incapable of any farther diminution. A microscope or telescope, which renders them visible, produces not any new rays of light, but only spreads those which always flowed from them, and by that means both gives parts to impressions which to the naked eye appear simple and uncompounded, and advances to a minimum what was formerly imperceptible. We may hence discover the error of the common opinion that the capacity of the mind is limited on both sides, and that it is impossible for the imagination to form an adequate idea of what goes beyond a certain degree of minuteness as well as of greatness. Nothing can be more minute than some ideas which we form in the fancy, and images which appear to the senses, since there are ideas and images perfectly simple and indivisible. The only defect of our senses is that they give us disproportioned images of things, and represent as minute and uncompounded what is really great and composed of a vast number of parts. This mistake we are not sensible of, but taking the impressions of those minute objects which appear to the senses to be equal or nearly equal to the objects, and finding by reason that there are other objects vastly more minute, we too hastily conclude that these are inferior to any idea of our imagination or impression of our senses. This, however, is certain, that we can form ideas which shall be no greater than the smallest atom of the animal spirits of an insect, 1,000 times less than a mite. And we ought rather to conclude that the difficulty lies in enlarging our conception so much as to form a just notion of a mite, or even of an insect 1,000 times less than a mite. For in order to form a just notion of these animals, we must have a distinct idea representing every part of them, which, according to the system of infinite divisibility, is utterly impossible, and according to that of indivisible parts or atoms, is extremely difficult by reason of the vast number and multiplicity of these parts. End of File 10.
All right, all right. This is sort of a very theoretical, what would it be, abstract kind of thinking. Um, how deep can you go in the minuteness and greatness, or infiniteness or infinitesimalness of ideas? So can you keep dividing ideas? No, I think that he's getting at, there is a minimum idea that is a ground floor idea. You can't go below that idea and create you can abstract smaller ideas like atoms, right? As quantum mechanics. But then we obviously go into something where our conceptualization or idea creation is vastly out of touch with what is actually going on, right? That's why, in my opinion, quantum mechanics is so strange, because we are in a more, let's say, macro idea level working, right? Working in a macro idea level. But, when we go to sizes of universe and beyond universe and multiverse, and sort of the limitation in at the other end of the scale also seems to come into that there is no bounds, it seems, to my mental representation. There's no wall or any sort of end to experience as such within the spatiality of my experience. I'm basically in the middle of something where I never can get to the sort of the bounds, and therefore we call that infinity. But it sort of fades into nothing kind of thing, right? And no matter how many telescopes and so on, and ideas and abstractions and models we put to it, we can never get to that kind of spatial end, and we cannot get to that minuteness of the spatial, infinitesimalness, right? So I would agree in some sense, some abstract sense, we are sort of caught in between infinity and infinitesimalness, right? I would agree with that. I think it's a good starting point, at least, right? And when we approach each of these ends, our ability to have an idea, or the ideas we create, or the abstract ideas we may create, we are using some prior idea which is not particularly geared towards creating that abstract idea of what we're dealing with in this particular scale, right? And that might be a reason why it's hard to understand infinity, and it's hard to understand quantum mechanics. It sort of fits, right? This guy, he's not stupid. He's quite bright, right? Thinking that he was in his late 20s when he wrote this, and he was working in the early 1700s, right? In the early part of the Enlightenment. I mean, he was basically, in a mainstream kind of sense, he is so far ahead of himself that he's still ahead of the general thinking of humankind, right?
File 12 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 2, Section 3, of the other qualities of our idea of space and time. No discovery could have been made more happily for deciding all controversies concerning ideas than that above mentioned, that impressions always take the precedency of them, and that every idea with which the imagination is furnished first makes its appearance in a correspondent
Whoops.
impression.
I have
File 11 of A Treatise of Human Nature
sorry about that.
by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 2, Section 2, of the infinite divisibility of space and time. Wherever ideas are adequate representations of objects, the relations, contradictions, and agreements of the ideas are all applicable to the objects. And this we may in general observe to be the foundation of all human knowledge. But
That's interesting. That's a big claim. This is a big claim. He might not have understood how important the idea of knowledge has become in recently, though epistemology is not something that was invented after Hume, but the term knowledge should be more sparsely used. So all human knowledge. So it's a very, very big claim, this, right? He might not be aware, he might not mean it exactly in this big manner, but wherever, and that's sort of also me maybe overinterpreting this, right? So that always, you have to bring your own mind along here, right? Wherever ideas are adequate representations of objects. Now, that's a new way he's connecting things here, right? He hasn't talked about objects in a clear manner before. An adequate representation, we can know that. I'm still trying to figure out whether or not he understands the problems, and I think that in the last part of this, in the last section of this part, he's going to discuss about an external world. So we will have to wait until then, right? But let me start over again. Wherever ideas are adequate representation of objects, the relations, contradictions, and agreements of the ideas are all applicable to the objects. And this we may in general observe to be the foundation of all human knowledge. So he is saying, implicitly, I would say, that what is knowledge is the ideas. It's not the impression. And I think I'm not sure, right? It's sort of, it's a very big statement, this. I'm not sure he really grasps how big the statement is. All human knowledge. So if it's all human knowledge, it may be that this system of talking about relations and contradiction agreements of the ideas are applicable to the objects. So the ideas represents the objects, and we are discussing the relation, contradiction, and agreements. This is the foundation of knowledge. So at least, knowledge has to be found within impressions and or ideas. So far, so good, right? According to Hume here. Okay. So, but we are not doing knowledge. We are doing metaphysics, right?
Our ideas are adequate representations of the most minute parts of extension. And through whatever divisions and subdivisions we may suppose these parts to be arrived at, they can never become inferior to some ideas which we form.
Okay, but our ideas are adequate representation of the most minute parts of extension. So parts, spatial parts, right? And through whatever divisions and subdivision we may suppose these parts to be arrived at, they can never become inferior to some ideas which we form. So you can never divide anything into something that isn't an idea. There has to be some prior idea that you divide it into. Otherwise, you are dividing beyond idea. If we talked about in the last part about abstraction, which was compositions of ideas. But can you take one idea and make a simple idea and complexify it by slicing it up into a complex idea, right? By creating subsets or a subset of ideas. Well, you will have to have some ideas in order to do that. Otherwise, you're creating something that isn't actually based on an idea, because you didn't have that idea already. If that idea was a simple idea, the simple idea shouldn't be able to be partitioned. Or at least that's the discussion he's doing here, as far as I can see, right? And it's an interesting thought, because can you keep on dividing things? Maybe you can do it in some kind of weird abstract manner, and that's what quantum mechanics, or those who are doing quantum mechanics, do. And maybe that's why it has become so harebrained weird, right? 12 dimensions and I don't know, superstrings and all sorts of weird shit, right? Because it's hard to take an idea on macro level and slice it up to smaller ideas that are also some other kinds of base, simple ideas, and then twist them into this idea in order to get to some reduction base somewhere that is maybe some kind of superstring, right? And this is actually an interesting thinking. He is already doing this in the 1740s, 1730s, right? So, and there's a foundational kind of thinking. Is it just futile, stupid juggling of abstractions to do quantum mechanics? For all I care, yes it is. I mean, I don't care about quantum mechanics, because it always ends up being the same old tomato I'm eating, right? So
the plain consequence is that whatever appears impossible and contradictory upon the comparison of these ideas must be really impossible and contradictory, without any further excuse or evasion. Everything.
Okay, so if there's something, an idea is different from another idea from a basic mental functionality that we do not necessarily can fabulate about, right? We can just think that if there's not a different idea, simple idea maybe, than this one, then it's the same idea. Either it's the same idea or it's a different idea. And if it's a simple idea, it can't be divided up in further simple ideas, because then you're either taking a complex idea and just differentiating into its simple idea constituents, or you're trying to force divide a simple idea into smaller bits, which you actually cannot do because you don't have those ideas. You are forcing a split in an idea that cannot be decomposed or further divided, right? So it's sort of setting some boundaries for how you can sort of fabulate, or maybe when you try to step out and, oh, maybe I can do this, maybe I can do that, he tries to always pull back and say, no, 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 you should stay put. You can't just violate the system you just set up. Now, another philosopher might have another system, another ontology than Hume, but Hume is trying to say, I am doing it without stepping out of the boundaries I have just put to myself. And he say, well, that's what other philosophers tend to do, and their disciple following along, right? They don't care to scrutinize the limitations they set, or maybe the lack of limitations they set in the structure of their ontology. So they can get away with all sorts of shit they shouldn't be able to get away with, because they're just creating shit out of nowhere, right? Okay.
Capable of being infinitely divided contains an infinite number of parts. Otherwise, the division would be stopped short by the indivisible parts, which we should immediately arrive at. If, therefore, any finite extension be infinitely divisible, it can be no contradiction to suppose that a finite extension contains an infinite number of parts. And vice versa, if it be a contradiction to suppose that a finite extension contains an infinite number of parts, no finite extension can be infinitely divisible. But that this latter supposition is absurd, I easily convince myself by the consideration of my clear ideas. I first take the least idea I can form of a part of extension, and being certain that there is nothing more minute than this idea, I conclude that whatever I discover by its means must be a real quality of extension. I then repeat this idea once, twice, thrice, etc., and find the compound idea of extension arising from its repetition always to augment and become double, triple, quadruple, etc., till at last it swells up to a considerable bulk, greater or smaller, in proportion as I repeat more or less the same idea. When I stop in the addition of parts, the idea of extension ceases to augment. And were I to carry on the addition in infinitum, I clearly perceive that the idea of extension must also become infinite. Upon the whole, I conclude that the idea of an infinite number of parts is individually the same idea with that of an infinite extension, that no finite extension is capable of containing an infinite number of parts, and consequently that no finite extension is infinitely divisible.
So this is extremely abstract, right? It is very eloquent and tries its best, in my opinion, to keep it as approachable as possible. I would have to go back and listen through this again in order to really digest what he's trying to say. Because it's a bit more than I can do on the fly here. So I'll keep it, I'll keep this. The basic conclusion that upon the whole, he says here, upon the whole, let me mark this. Upon the whole, I conclude that the idea of an infinite number apart is individually the same idea with that of an infinite extension. So it has to be infinitely extended if they have infinite number of parts. So if it's a finite extension, then it must have a finite number of parts, right? So consequently, that no finite extension is infinitely divisible. It sort of goes with it's a kind of a basic logic. This, right? I am. This is the old atomists. It's a actually mentions the term atom. I think that is a well-known term that goes back to the Greek, but I would, you can lecture me on that possibly, right? Who were the atomists? I forget the names of these philosophers who talked about this. If something can be infinitely divided, then it's infinitely large. But if it's a finite object, there must be some minute thing that you can't divide any further. Otherwise, you would either divide it into nothing, so it would disappear, but that's obviously not the case, right? But if it's something, then it's infinitely large, and that's not the case either if you have a cucumber or something idea like that, right? So I would say it's an adherence to the atomists of old, right? To the best of my understanding, but
Footnote 3. It has been objected to me that infinite divisibility supposes only an infinite number of proportional, not of aliquot parts, and that an infinite number of proportional parts does not form an infinite extension. But this distinction is entirely frivolous. Whether these parts be called aliquot or proportional, they cannot be inferior to those minute parts we conceive, and therefore cannot form a less extension by their conjunction. End of footnote 3. I may subjoin another argument proposed by a noted author, Monsieur Malizieu, which seems to me very strong and beautiful. It is evident that existence in itself belongs only to unity and is never applicable to number, but on account of the units of which the number is composed. 20 men may be said to exist, but it is only because 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. are existent. And if you deny the existence of the latter, that of the former falls, of course. It is therefore utterly absurd to suppose any number to exist and yet deny the existence of units. And as extension is always a number according to the common sentiment of metaphysicians, and never resolves itself into any unit or indivisible quantity, it follows that extension can never at all exist. It is in vain to reply that any determinate quantity of extension is an unit, but such a one as admits of an infinite number of fractions and is inexhaustible in its subdivisions. For by the same rule these 20 men may be considered as a unit, the whole globe of the earth, nay, the whole universe, may be considered as a unit. That term of unity is merely a fictitious denomination which the mind may apply to any quantity of objects it collects together, nor can...
This is very, very good, in my opinion. He is so fucking sharp. It's this thing that is very problematic and very difficult to handle by philosophers, in my opinion. Labels and words and such, they are just labels and words that have some kind of reference to something. The interesting thing philosophically is, what is it actually that which is being referred to? And that's where all these sort of baggage with terms that are being used have some preconceived idea that people bring along when you mention the word, infinity, right? Or 20, or a bunch of cows, or whatever it is, right? Maybe those were not good examples, but I think you know what I mean. As a philosopher, you have to turn it the other way around. You have to be able, though you're using language, You have to start from the other end and say, okay, I'm working from this basic language, I'm creating this philosophy and reaching this result. That result I will call idea, for instance, right? So you have an understanding of what you mean by idea. What is usually going on is people are throwing around terms left and right, and sort of this, that, and the other, right? The world and reality and the universe and cosmos and nature and whatever. It's like, hold on. These are just terms and labels you're throwing around, right? So, and as he says, what he says here, that of utterly absurd to common sentiment of solve determined concept. Yeah, he says the term of unity is merely a term of unity. It's merely a fictitious denomination. If you say family, right? That's a fictitious denomination. Family is not an idea, right? It's just a denomination. You're saying, okay, there are these ideas for individuals. There's some, causation of interactions that are supposed to have happened in the past with these people. I will denominate them family. But family has no standalone existence in the form of an idea. Right? So be careful when terms are being used. Are they actually terms for ideas, or are they just sort of, I will bring these things together and give them a denomination as if it's an idea, right? Because there's some kind of reference to an object here, right? You are part of this family and you're pointing to an object or an idea, right? An impression which is based on, that has an built-in idea, however you want to put it, right? So just be careful with these, and he rightfully points this out, in my opinion.
And such a unity any more exist alone than number can, as being in reality a true number. But the unity which can exist alone and whose existence is necessary to that of all number is of another kind, and must be perfectly indivisible and incapable of being resolved into any lesser unity.
So there's in some sense, he says, in my opinion, I will have to treat ideas of potentially having a minimal size, right? There's a point where they're indivisible, and I would think that he says that a simple idea cannot be further divided, right? There might be something going on that ultimately the mind treats as an idea, which has some sub things going on, right? But we can never get to that because the mind doesn't do that. And he would like to stay away from doing it because it's not apparent to him in his immediate experience, right? It's only something that he sits and thinking about, maybe I can divide this idea further. Yeah, maybe you can do that in your mind, but that would not be a potential representation of what is really going on, right? So stay away from just letting your mind go astray into all sorts of fabulations and cloud castles, right?
All this reasoning takes place with regard to time, along with an additional argument which it may be proper to take notice of. It is a property inseparable from time, and which in a manner constitutes its essence, that each of its parts succeeds another, and that none of them, however contiguous, can ever be coexistent. For the same reason that the year 1737 cannot concur with the present year 1738.
So he's writing this in 1738, right? And the book was published in 1739 and 1740, as best I understand.
Every moment must be distinct from and posterior or antecedent to another. It is certain, then, that time, as it exists, must be composed of indivisible moments. For if in time we could never arrive at an end of division, and if each moment as it succeeds another were not perfectly single and indivisible, there would be an infinite number of coexistent moments or parts of time, which I believe will be allowed to be an errant contradiction. The infinite divisibility of space implies that of time, as is evident from the nature of motion. If the latter, therefore, be impossible, the former must be equally so.
It is interesting to ponder about to what degree that Einstein might have been inspired by these thoughts of Hume. I don't know if Einstein had any idea of Hume or had read Hume. I would suppose maybe he had. But it's interesting that he mentions space and time in the same kind of headline and chapter, right? That if there's some connection between them, right? Space and time is mentioned in the same chapter. They are dealt with in the same fashion. They have the same kind of problems of infinity and infinitesimality, or whatever it's called. It's just an interesting thought that, I mean, he's so ahead of his time here, right?
I doubt not, but it will readily be allowed by the most obstinate defender of the doctrine of infinite divisibility that these arguments are difficulties, and that it is impossible to give any answer to them which will be perfectly clear and satisfactory. But here we may observe that nothing can be more absurd than this custom of calling a difficulty what pretends to be a demonstration, and endeavoring by that means to elude its force and evidence. It is not in demonstrations as in probabilities that difficulties can take place, and one argument counterbalance another and diminish its authority. A demonstration, if just, admits of no opposite difficulty, and if not just, it is a mere sophism, and consequently can never be a difficulty. It is either irresistible or has no manner of force. To talk, therefore, of objections and replies, and balancing of arguments in such a question as this, is to confess either that human reason is nothing but a play of words, or that the person himself who talks so has not a capacity equal to such subjects. Demonstrations may be difficult to be comprehended because of abstractedness of the subject, but can never have such difficulties as will weaken their authority when once they are comprehended. It is true, mathematicians are wont to say, that there are here equally strong arguments on the other side of the question, and that the doctrine of indivisible points is also liable to unanswerable objections. Before I examine these arguments and objections in detail, I will here take them in a body and endeavor by a short and decisive reason to prove at once that it is utterly impossible they can have any just foundation. It is an established maxim in metaphysics that whatever the mind clearly conceives includes the idea of possible existence, or in other words, that nothing we imagine is absolutely impossible. We can...
That's an interesting sentence. It is an established maxim in metaphysics. That's a little fluffy. I would like to have some references here. That whatever the mind clearly conceives, not perceives, but conceives. What's the difference between perception and conception? If perception is unwillful experiences, then conceiving is something that you construct. So if you can construct as I talked about in the prior part, that if you can construct a 10-legged polar bear in your mind, then he says, includes the idea of possible existence. It includes the idea of possible existence. Now he's sort of screwing around with the term idea here, because it seems to be used in another meaning. Includes the idea of possible. An idea cannot be possible existence because idea was opposite to impressions. But maybe he should have said includes the notion of possible existence. Or in other words, that nothing we imagine is absolutely impossible. I think I agree with that. It's not necessarily possible either, right? You can imagine it, but you can't say if it's impossible. But you can't say it's necessarily possible either, right? It's just because I can imagine maybe I cannot imagine a 100-legged polar bear, right? Because I would just have a polar bear and then say it has 100 legs, right? But I could maybe imagine a 5-legged polar bear or a 6-legged polar bear, right? With a normal polar bear with a leg sticking out on each side or something like that, right? I find it possible to do that. So he would say, in other words, if we imagine it, it should be possible to exist. It's possible, but it is not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily exist just because it's possible to exist. So it's sort of he's trying to refrain. He's not saying whatever you could come up with that you haven't experienced doesn't mean that it cannot possibly exist. But he doesn't say either. He holds back and say just because you can imagine it doesn't mean it actually exists, right? So he's being that skeptic, which is so fucking critical here, right? He's not saying you can or can't just because you can imagine something. So you have to stay on your toes here, right? Not going in either way, right? I really, really like this one. I really like it, right?
Form the idea of a golden mountain, and from thence conclude that such a mountain may actually exist. We can form no idea of a mountain without a valley, and therefore regard it as impossible. Now it is certain we have an idea of extension, for otherwise why do we talk?
Okay, so a mountain without a valley is impossible. No, but maybe it's some kind of tautology, or it's sort of built into the. If you say mountain, it's the same as saying valley, in a sense, right? Because one isn't there without the other, so one goes without the other. So you can't say if you say mountain, you are automatically saying valley, right? And if you start to say there's no valley there, you're just screwing around with your terms. You're not, right? And all these kinds of things are also lending itself into some kind of logic here, some kind of deductive logic, I would say, right?
And reason concerning it. It is likewise certain that this idea, as conceived by the imagination, though divisible into parts or inferior ideas, is not infinitely divisible, nor consists of an infinite number of parts, for that exceeds the comprehension of our limited capacities. Here, then, is an idea of extension which consists of parts or inferior ideas that are perfectly indivisible. Consequently, this idea implies no contradiction. Consequently, it is possible for extension really to exist conformable to it. And consequently, all the arguments employed against the possibility of mathematical points are mere scholastic quibbles and unworthy of our attention. These consequences.
Okay, so he's saying he's mostly concerned with divisibility, I think, here, right? Though he's also concerned about infinity, or questions about understandings of infinity and so on. That you might be able to create some kind of abstract division of an idea in sort of a mathematical sense, and in a superstring kind of sense, or whatever. Okay, fair enough. But it's sort of scholastic quibbles or something like he categorizes that, right? and it's not worthy of our attention. No, that it's a good idea to set some boundaries for how much nerdiness you can go into here, right? And he says, okay, we're working with ideas and impressions. I have told you a bit about, the limitations in this end and that end. I'm sticking to this, right? He's sort of open for, you can go and knock yourself out with all sorts of thinking here, right? But I'm staying with this. So that's sort of what I'm hearing.
We may carry one step farther and conclude that all the pretended demonstrations for the infinite divisibility of extension are equally sophistical, since it is certain these demonstrations cannot be just without proving the impossibility of mathematical points, which it is an evident absurdity to pretend to. End
Okay, so this is the end of this one.
of file 11. File 12 of a Treatise of Human Nature.
So, these consequences we may carry one step further and conclude that all the pretended demonstrations for the infinite divisibility of extension are equally sophistical, since it is certain that these demonstrations cannot be just without proving the impossibility of mathematical points, which is an evident absurdity to pretend to. No. And it's sort of when we go into, that's why mathematics is an abstraction, right? If you take Euclid, the first lemma or axiom, whatever he calls it, is a point is that which does not have any extension. So if it doesn't have any extension, it cannot be there, right? But still you're saying it's there. So all of geometry and mathematics and so on is based on an impossibility, right? So geometry and so on, it's based on a point which cannot possibly exist anyway. So it's pure abstraction. Mathematics is and geometry and so is pure abstraction. It should be kind of obvious, right? And he's not doing mathematics here, he's doing philosophy, right? Philosophy that ultimately have to be functional in the actual world that I am having an impression of, right? Okay, so that would be the end of this part in my series here, and I hope you enjoyed it, and please give me your comments, and please share, like, and subscribe if you think I'm doing a good job. Please follow me. You will be advised on new parts in the series. And beyond that, have a nice day. See you in the next one.